Flash in the Dark, Chapter 31, Giving to the Community. Bruce Wayne smiled to himself as he looked out the window of his private jet. He had visited Central City before, several times. He had a branch of Wayne Enterprises in the city, after all. He had one in nearly every major city. Most recently, he'd visited about 2 weeks after the particle accelerator exploded to help with the rebuilding effort. He hadn't been able to stay long, but he'd made donations to many of the charities around town, as well as a significant donation to the CCPD, who had been personally affected as one of their own had been struck by the lightning. From the storm, the accelerator had ceded. He didn't know much about the CSI, only their position at the CCPD. He hadn't been back since, but Central had made it back onto his radar in the last month. Sightings of the red streak, now called the Flash, by most had caught his interests. Another vigilante on the streets. He couldn't help but be interested. He'd yet to meet the Arrow, though he'd met his alter ego a few times. Oliver Queen couldn't be more obvious as the green-hooded vigilante, at least not to him. But he was one of the better detectives on the planet, if not the best. He strove to be. But he knew nothing about the Flash, save that she was female. No one had gotten a good look at her. No one could manage a clear picture. She was just too quick. But Bruce was good at what he did. From the information he'd managed to gather, he had made the logical leap that she was slightly shorter, around 5 feet, at most 5'6". Small in most aspects as well, built like a runner, streamlined all over. Likely a brunette, if the small brown streaks at head height in the few photos of the Flash were accurate. Everything else was speculation. She would have to be high energy, at least if her powers were any indication. Likely, she would have to eat several times more than most, as powers like that would likely affect physiology as well. He sipped his coffee as his pilot announced that they would be landing in 15 minutes. Barry was running late. She was always late. Always had been, likely always would be. But at least she had an excuse. Well, she had a legitimate one. She'd been taking care of another armored car robbery when the getaway car driver, an older gentleman, had had a stroke and driven straight into a transformer, the one that happened to control the electricity for her block. She'd saved his life and apprehended the rest of the crew before running home and changing in a dark apartment and running to work at normal speeds. Captain Singh had sighed heavily but admitted that her alarm not going off due to the power outage was beyond her control. She was up in her lab when she received the emailed memo for a meeting for all personnel at 3 that day. She sighed and showed up to the meeting 5 minutes late. The door slammed closed behind her more loudly than she'd expected, and she winced. Captain Singh didn't even look up. "Thank you for joining us, Miss Allen. Now, as I was saying, we have a VIP coming into the city for a week this afternoon. Several of you already know this. I've assigned extra officers to the blocks surrounding Wayne Enterprises while he's in town. He's got his own personal security detail from what I hear. The reason I've called all you in here is because Mr. Wayne has offered to throw a fundraising ball for the precinct." There were mixed reactions to this news. Most of the CSIs groaned in annoyance, Barry included. She really wasn't one for parties. None of them were. But the CSI department was required to have at least one member present to these sorts of functions. Normally, choosing the unlucky person came down to a high-stakes game of rock, paper, scissors. Barry was fantastic at that game, and almost never went to these functions. She really wasn't good at crowds like that. The Queen Gala had been different. She'd had Felicity and Hal, and Oliver. It had at least been interesting. Captain Singh was talking again. "Mr. Wayne has been extremely generous to the precinct before, namely after the particle accelerator incident," Singh pointed out. One of the officers piped up. "Why is he donating so much to us? He's a Gotham boy," he called out. There were murmurs of agreement from the others. Captain Singh sighed. "I don't know for sure. but he seems to be pretty generous with every precinct in every city where he has a branch of Wayne Enterprises. We'll need a representative from every department. Yes, that includes the CSI department. But as getting any of you to show up to these things is like pulling teeth. And since Miss Allen was late again, she's just volunteered. Singh said, pointing at her. Barry groaned loudly as the other CSIs cheered, quietly exchanging high fives. It's this coming Wednesday. It's fancy dress. Please don't be late. The captain said, staring Barry down. It was Monday morning. Barry had 2 days to find a way out of this. Captain Singh released them back to their normal jobs, and Eddie patted Barry on the shoulder. Bad luck, Barry. At least you'll have people you know there. I've already volunteered. We get a +1. I'm bringing Iris, he said, shrugging slightly. Barry's pout slipped lightly. At least she would have someone to talk to. She sighed and went back up to her lab. Bruce was getting bored. Board meetings, while important, were never a lot of fun. At least the view out the window of the room was fantastic. He could see the entire Central City skyline. It made it very easy to see the large plume of smoke that blossomed over Mercury Labs. The explosion cut the meeting short, and Bruce raced off to see the flash. He reached the scene in time to see a flash of red and gold rush into the burning lab. Scientists began appearing on the sidewalk in their smoldering lab coats. Several were still holding tablets and various other equipment. Within 5 minutes, the whole building was evacuated onto the now very crowded sidewalk. While the building was still smoking, it seemed like the fire was at least controlled by the time the fire truck arrived. Just then, Bruce spotted someone at the side of the building holding a backpack and a slim metal object in his hand. One of the scientists must have noticed him too, for she shouted, "Bomb!" and everyone hit the deck. Bruce was closest to the man and felt himself moving against his will as the man pressed the detonator. The explosion was not as big as he'd been expecting. The man clearly hadn't had much experience building bombs. Bruce looked up into the face of the woman in red. She was short, like he'd guessed, brown hair in a long ponytail through a hole at the back of her scarlet mask. She was looking over her shoulder at where the fire from the explosion was still burning. But he could see her eyes. They were a bright hazel that seemed to crackle with lightning. She turned back to him and her face blurred, so the details he'd managed to spot were no longer visible. "Are you all right, sir?" Her voice was distorted, almost like her vocal cords were vibrating. Bruce nodded. The Flash nodded and raced off to see if she could get the fire under control. Bruce stared after her as the firefighters got the blaze under control and a streak of lightning raced away from the scene.